Hello, everyone. I am just getting started here. Hopefully you can see my screen. I am one of your TAs for social problems. My name is Allison. Hopefully you've seen my introduction video on Canvas, but if not, I am a six-year PhD candidate in political science. And actually, just last week, I defended my dissertation, which means that I am Dr. Roland. So it's really exciting to be here and to share my work with you in this kind of space. I know that you're just watching this lecture, so it's not very interactive, but just so you know, I am always excited and happy for people to reach out to me. And my email is down here, if you can see it. Here, let me go back. Right here. So feel free to email me if you have any questions or you want to talk about anything that I bring up today. So today what I want to do is talk a little bit about my dissertation research, the project that I've been working on for the last few years, and connect it back to the course material for this week. So this week we're talking about finding solutions and creating social change. It's a really exciting topic to end the course off on because you spent the whole quarter learning about different social problems, learning about war and the environment, crime and drugs. And so it's really exciting to think about, okay, now what? What can we do to address these social issues? And that's actually a huge part of what my dissertation research is about, identifying social problems and figuring out how people work together, form collective action to address those issues. So the topic of my presentation today, and again, this is just a brief snippet of the project. So like I said, I'm happy to talk more about it, is how sex workers navigate legal precarity and social stigma. So before the onset of this presentation, I always like to talk to people about what is sex work and what is not sex work. I know it can be um, an uncomfortable or even heated topic to talk about, so I like to talk about this before we get into it. When I'm talking about sex work, I'm talking about a consensual exchange of sexual services. And that's a really broad definition, but it's purposely broad to encompass a range of activities from, full service sex work to online work to sugar dating and other activities like that. In this definition, it is distinct and separate from human trafficking. So human trafficking is a very real issue, and it's all about coercion and force. So if people are being forced to perform sexual services, then we wouldn't call that sex work. That would be human trafficking. Of course, we can have a broader debate, and trust me, I would love to have this conversation about how much consent and free will we have under a system of capitalism and exploitation. So we can have that conversation, but for now, the simplest way to understand the distinction here is sex work requires an aspect of consent, and human trafficking is about force and coercion. So again, happy to say more about this if you are ever curious about it, but just so you have that definition in mind while we move forward. So today I'm going to share a little bit about the research question that guides my broader dissertation project. I'm going to share some information about how sex work is regulated across the globe. What are the different models of regulation, and how does that impact how sex workers are treated under the law and by society more broadly. I'm going to talk a lot about criminalization. Criminalization is the model of regulation that we use in the United States and is actually the most common model of regulation for sex work across the world. So I'll talk a lot about criminalization and the impacts of it because it's been very well documented and researched the kinds of impacts criminalization has on sex workers. Then I'm going to talk about how I collected data for my research project, what that looked like, and some of the findings. And again, the broader topic of this week on social change and creating change is really guiding this project, and I'll explain how as we move through the presentation. So, my research question is, how do sex workers respond, resist, and otherwise navigate legal and social harm? So if you look at this question, you can see some of the implicit assumptions that I'm making. The first is that sex workers are in fact subject to legal and social harm. So there are real harms that sex workers experience from both the law and regulations, and then interpersonally and socially as well. The second assumption I'm making is that sex workers are actively involved in resisting and responding to these harmful conditions, that they are politically engaged in ways that seek to reduce the harm they experience. Okay, so let's continue. Why focus on sex workers' rights? Why do we care? What is the importance of this? Well, besides what I would consider a normative commitment to caring about people, caring about how people thrive and survive, you could also talk about the fact that the way marginalized people are treated in society is indicative of how sex workers are treated and vice versa. So a lot of sex workers are from other marginalized groups, such as people of color, such as transgender and gender nonconforming communities, queer people, disabled people, and other groups that are both socially stigmatized and then legally marginalized as well. So since there's a high crossover here between the communities who do sex work and these other precarious communities, it's really important to care about the rights of sex workers. The more rights sex workers have, the more access to welfare services, to stronger labor protections, then the better off people will be overall. So I call this a litmus test for other marginalized groups. Sex workers' rights are a litmus test for understanding how other precarious people are treated. Sorry, my dog is just trying to play right now. This is Fubu. He is being chaotic, so a little intermission there. And then on the other hand, we have a transnational labor movement. So people are pushing at the international level, at the local level for better labor conditions. I am trained as an international relations scholar, so I do a lot of work around what the United Nations is doing, what these international institutions are doing to promote labor rights, to promote human rights more broadly. And they have this initiative, the UN, that they're working on as part of their sustainable development goals. Again, if you want to talk more about that, I am happy to. They have something called their decent work agenda. And this is all where they're trying to push for better labor conditions for people globally. So my argument here is that if we really want to promote better working conditions for people, we have to attend to the working conditions of sex workers. We can't ignore that sex work exists. We can't wish it out of existence. Instead, we should address the material conditions today so people can have a better tomorrow. And then finally, I think we should care about this because sex workers, like any other group, are practicing politics and are practicing care. So it's really important to pay attention to how people who are in conditions of violence, both state enforced, interpersonally enforced, how people are navigating that, because this is really important strategies for us if we are interested in creating social change. Okay, so that's a little bit about why we should care, what this project is about. Now we can get into those models of regulation that I talked about. So the first model of regulation, well, it doesn't really matter the order, but one of the models of regulation is criminalization. So criminalization is what the US has. This is when both the selling and purchase of sexual services is illegal. So you can be arrested for it and you can be penalized with fines or subject to other punishments. Then there's legalization. So this usually removes penalties for people buying and selling. Sometimes it only removes penalties for selling, so the purchaser of sex can still be criminalized and subject to fines. And usually it creates additional regulations and hoops for people to jump through. For instance, it could require that they register themselves as a sex worker with the state, so be part of a registry of sex workers. It could require them to pay certain fees annually, of course, like be probably taxed by the state. So it adds, sometimes it can add stronger protections for workers, and sometimes it can have more negative consequences than positive ones, making it much more exclusive for people to be able to work as a sex worker. People usually gravitate towards sex work as a survival strategy because other more formal forms of employment discriminate against them or are inaccessible to them. So legalizing sex work can sometimes have the unfortunate effect of just making it harder for people to access and kind of forcing them to go even further underground. You can think about what the impact of the legalization of marijuana has been, and it's a bit of a similar situation. We do have legalization of sex work through brothels in Nevada, in certain parts of Nevada. And there's a lot of research on the impacts of legalization on sex workers in different countries. So legalization is also referred to as the end demand model, the equality model, the Nordic model. It has a lot of different names and it is kind of confusing for people. Um, Again, when we're talking about the end demand model, the idea here is, oh, we won't criminalize the sex worker, we'll criminalize the buyer, and by doing so, we'll decrease the demand for sex work. And the research actually documents that it just makes it more unsafe for the sex worker because the kinds of clients that are willing to risk arrest are usually less desirable clients for people to work with. So happy to provide some sources on that. And you can see these different names here below. Finally, we get to decriminalization. So decriminalization is a very specific model of regulation. Sometimes things are called decriminalization that are actually not. So you have to really look carefully at what the laws are being proposed to make sure it's actually decriminalization. And this is just the removal of criminal penalties for buying and selling sex. So unlike legalization, it's not introducing extra steps and barriers. It is just removing the criminal penalties. So people are allowed to engage in sex work without fear of arrest. And this is overwhelmingly the model of regulation that sex workers themselves are advocating for. You can look at the work of Decrim Sex Work California, of there's groups also Swap LA, there's Swap USA. There's a lot of different sex worker organizations just in the United States that are very actively advocating for decriminalization. And it's also a global movement. Groups across the world are advocating for decriminalization, such as Swarm and English Collective of Prostitutes, which are in the UK. There's, I think it's called Butterfly in Canada. So a lot of different groups are pursuing decriminalization. Okay, so we have these models of regulation in mind. And like I said, criminalization is the most popular one globally. So what does that mean? What does that look like for people? Well, first of all, it increases the violence people experience. There are a few reasons why this is the case. One, criminalizing anything, right, requires increased law enforcement and police investment. So, for example, in Los Angeles, sex work being criminalized means that police can use things like loitering laws to profile people as sex workers and arrest them on the basis of assuming that they do sex work. And this is something that actually happened Um, I believe it's with, yeah, loitering with the intent to commit prostitution, which used to be on the books but was overturned due to sex worker activists. So this is a very real risk that happens. And we know that there is a double marginalization for people of color and for other marginalized groups. So criminalization impacts everybody negatively. But then for people who are doubly marginalized, police and law enforcement, right, are more likely to profile them, more likely to arrest them for the same kinds of crimes. This is something we see as an issue with criminalization more broadly. Again, thinking about the marijuana industry, thinking about how laws are used against undocumented folks. Um, this is like a broader systemic issue with our criminal injustice system. And you can look at some resources from ACLU, from Amnesty International, also from the Human Rights Watch, which goes into much further detail about the consequences of criminalization. Okay, so we've established some groundwork. We know, okay, criminalization is the most common model. It hurts people. Now what, right? My research question, if you recall, is about what are sex workers doing about it, right? How are they mobilizing? How are they engaging? The readings for this week talk about the different ways people protest and how people engage in social justice issues. So this is a really compatible presentation for those readings that can kind of already get you started thinking about these issues. For my dissertation, I look at 3 field sites, so the US, the UK, and Australia. The reason I chose these 3 field sites is because each one represents a model of regulation. The US is criminalization, the UK is legalization, and Australia, in some of its provinces, is decriminalization. And so what I did for my dissertation is I interviewed sex workers who were operating in one or many of these field sites. And I did so by collaborating with sex worker-led organizations that were operating in cities in these different countries. So, for example, groups in Los Angeles, groups in London, and groups in Sydney. And this photo is one that I took during fieldwork when I was in London, where I went to an event that was hosted by one of the sex worker organizations I was in contact with. A super cool place. So what did I find from these interviews? What information arose from this? Well, something that I expected to find is that stigma and really messy laws make it difficult for sex workers to participate in politics, to function broadly in society, but also to participate in politics, right? We know that there is a lot of stigma around sex work, and we could have many, many conversations about it. And again, I'm happy to have those conversations with you. And we know, again, that there's a lot of messy legal apparatus around it, right? Same with prior to the legalization of weed or marijuana, people were still smoking. People were still using cannabis products. There was just much more risk associated with it. And that risk was inequitably enforced, right? Some people would be able to do it and some people would be arrested for it. And we still have people arrested or in prison for cannabis, right? So it's a very similar situation. Even though the laws on the books in the US, for example, criminalize sex work, there's also a very active street-based sex work industry in Los Angeles that the cops are very aware of and do sometimes arrest people and then sometimes don't. What I find, though, is that despite this really complex social and legal environment, sex workers in all of my field sites were very active in advocating for their rights. And they did so through both formal political means and informal political means. And I'll talk about what that means, the formal and informal practices. And then this photo is a picture at the LA City Hall. It's from a protest called a die-in. So that's where people pretend to die in a public setting in order to be visually disruptive and to demonstrate the human cost associated with policies. So this was in response to increased policing of Figueroa Corridor, which is where a lot of street-based sex workers are operating. So we have this little chart here, and this is how I conceptualize the political practices sex workers engage in. So you have at the top, right, I'll use my cursor, you have sex workers' political practices, and then there's formal strategies and informal strategies. The formal ones are state-oriented. So this means that these are the practices sex workers are using to engage with the state or with government, right? So these are things they're doing to change laws on the books or to make some other kind of impact on the government or on society more broadly. Informal strategies are community-oriented ones. So these are by sex workers for sex workers. And you see here, I have classified, what these strategies can look like. This is not exhaustive. I'm sure there's more, but these are just some of the things that came up in my interviews with people. For formal strategies, a lot of it was political advocacy. So this looked like protests, demonstrations. This also looked like submitting written comments to legislators, or lobbying legislators, or going to the Capitol, Sacramento, and speaking to people there. So a lot of political advocacy. And then it also looked like public education. So raising awareness about the issues sex workers experience, holding workshops in community spaces so that the general public can learn more about what's going on, raising awareness through social media posts, all really important strategies that social movements in general use, organizations in general use, but that sex workers were also using. And then there's these informal strategies. So again, these are community-oriented strategies. And there's relationship building, mutual aid, and information sharing. Perhaps you've heard of mutual aid before. This is like a very, again, common strategy that groups use. And this is basically resource sharing. So it's resource sharing with people you're already in community with. It's different than charity. It's not a charity-based model. It's you helping someone out and they're helping you out, and you're invested in each other because you know that you are community with each other and rely on one another. It's all about being in solidarity with people. So mutual aid can be exchanging clothing. It can be giving somebody a ride to school or to the hospital. It can be buying somebody a meal. Anything that's like a resource, like a survival resource, exchanging those survival resources. I also have information sharing on here. Information sharing can relate to mutual aid, but it's like a more specific tactic. So I think about, gossip culture, chisme culture. The importance of sharing information has been well established in other scholarship. And especially for sex workers, sharing information can be life-saving, life-sustaining, right? Examples of this include um, sometimes they're called like black books or bad date lists. So this is where sex workers can share with one another, hey, I had an experience with this client. They look like so and so. I met them in so and so location, and they were really violent or unsafe, or they ripped me off and didn't give me the pay rate that I was negotiating. So it's just a way of providing people with information on safety practices and on clients that again can be really critical in these more criminalized and surveilled environments. And then there's relationship building. Relationship building is really critical and fundamental to any kind of organizing or social movement. Your relationships with people is what sustains and or breaks the success of a social movement. So sex workers that I talked with who are really engaged in organizing, especially for sex worker rights, were doing so because of the people that they loved, that they knew, that they were in community with. So it was really important, these relationships in these organizing spaces. Okay, so I shared, these formal and informal strategies, and my argument here is that these are political practices sex workers are using to navigate their legal precarity and the social harm that they experience. Now, I just want to provide a few examples of what this looks like from the information that I received through my interviews and through social media analysis I did through talking with people. So I'll provide an example of political advocacy, which based on that chart I showed you, I can go back to it maybe. Political advocacy is a formal strategy, so it's usually state-oriented. So one of the groups that I spoke with is the English Collective of Prostitutes. It's a pretty established group in London. They've been active for many decades, and they're doing really cool work. So you could definitely look them up on Instagram, or they have a website, and I recommend taking a look at what they're doing. And one of their big concerns, well, they had two big concerns. One is increasing xenophobia and fear mongering around migrants and undocumented people. And of course, you see that echoed in the United States, and it's very present in England as well. So there's that as one dimension. And then the other dimension is attacks on sex working mothers in particular. So sex working parents being highly criminalized and surveilled by the state. Now, if you recall, sex work in London or in England is legalized. So it is a legal enterprise for people to be selling sex. Despite the fact that it is legal, the English Collective of Prostitutes sees high levels of arrest, high levels of police harassment for undocumented and migrant sex workers and for sex workers who are parents. So this is a screenshot here of an Instagram post from ECP, and they collaborated with Open Democracy on this article. The title here is Stop Punishing Sex Worker Moms by Taking Kids Away. And there's this quote from Nikki Adams, who is one of the spokespeople for ECP, and she's one of the people that I was able to interview, a very cool person. So this quote says, social services are prejudiced and sexist in their treatment of women and mothers generally. And this is compounded when women are immigrants and doing sex work. We have seen this with sex working moms who, despite their massive efforts to escape violence, are judged, with social workers implying the woman was putting her child at risk. So in my interview with her, and then in the advocacy work that she does and that ECP is doing more broadly, they're really trying to bring attention to the fact that legalization is not enough to protect people from state violence. People who are more marginalized, right? So talking about this prejudice and sexist treatment is compounded by these other intersecting identities. Legalization is not enough to protect people. Now you might think, oh, if you're playing, devil's advocate, you might think, oh, why shouldn't they have their kids taken away? Or, oh, you know, XYZ. You can say all kinds of all kinds of stuff, right? But at the end of the day, if we're talking about wanting people to have better lives, and we're talking about wanting people to be provided for, Taking children away simply for the work somebody's engaged in is just not the way to do it, especially when that work is legal, but in any respect, right? So the kind of change that ECP is advocating for is the protection of sex workers as a way to protect people who come from all kinds of marginalized backgrounds. So on this issue, they've collaborated with researchers, they've hosted film and documentary screenings. There's like a really good screening they did about a sex working mom. If I can find it, I will definitely send it to y'all. But you can also email me and I'll send it to you. They've done public demonstrations, and all of this is forms of political advocacy and also public education that they're doing to raise awareness about this issue. Okay, another example of a strategy is relationship building, and this is an informal strategy. So this is community oriented, it's by sex workers and for sex workers. And remember, I said relationship building is really, really critical for creating social change because you need to have those relationships with people in order to sustain organizing efforts. We never organize in a vacuum or by ourselves, it's always in relation to other people. So this is a quote from one of my interviews with someone who has been involved in sex worker activism for a while. In it, they say, I've been able to plug in different ways, and usually at the beck and call of my friends or who are also sex worker organizers. So I feel that's usually what ends up happening is that I'm just answering a call or a need that is expressed by someone who I have a relationship with and care about. So that's often how I end up getting involved. And I think it's usually just kind of addressing something that either is an urgent need or a topic that we want to explore more deeply. So this snippet is from my interview with her. And in this interview, we're talking about how she got involved in sex worker organizing and kind of what she sees as the stakes of being involved in the movement. And she was just talking about, hey, I'm involved in organizing because the people I love are being hurt. And so I'm doing things in order to solve that or to address that harm. And this was something that was overwhelmingly represented in my interviews with people, that people who were actively involved in organizing were doing so because of the people that they knew and the people that they were in community with. So it really emphasized to me that a lot of our political engagement is kind of based on the community that we surround ourselves with. And also, if we're not politically engaged, that could also be a reflection of who we're around with. This kind of connects to the article for this week about social activism when you're on college campuses versus not on college campuses. Some environments are more conducive to being politically active. What's really interesting in this case is that most of the time being a sex worker is not conducive to being politically active, right? Because even if you're not criminalized, you're socially stigmatized. And yet, sex workers are doing it anyway because the stakes for them are so significant and so heavy that it's worth being involved and being invested. Okay, so what does this all mean? Why do we care about this? What are some of the implications of this project? Well, time and time again, and this is something again established by so many other research studies, that criminalization is still really harmful. It's very harmful for people. At the same time, legalization is not enough. So people think, oh, if we legalize sex work, this solves all the issues. That's just not the case. It's not reflected in people's lived experiences. As I was saying, even in a legalized environment, people are still harmed. And in fact, some of the people I spoke with, um, when they were working as a legal sex worker, they had their home raided by police. They had their bank accounts frozen and all their money seized by the state. So there are a lot of different ways harm manifests, even in those legal environments. Also, This research shows that even when people are experiencing state harm, they can still be politically active. And in fact, we know this, right? We see this in other social movements. We see this especially in the mobilization for Gaza and against the Palestinian genocide, right? People are being very active despite extreme conditions of violence inflicted by the state and by other people interpersonally as well. So the stakes are really high for people, and when they are, they will find a way to engage and to push back. And then finally, a lot of the political practices that I observe sex workers engage in are also forms of care, community care, right? So when I talk about mutual aid, information sharing, relationship building, all those informal strategies, they're all rooted in community care and themselves are a practice of that care, right? I care for you, so I'm going to share resources with you. I care for you, so I want to deepen and strengthen our relationship. And that's really cool. It's cool that our politics can be connected to our care and vice versa. And of course, for me, the stakes of sex worker organizing is always rooting back in the fact that if we really want to liberate people, if we really want a better society, we cannot forget sex workers. We cannot leave people excluded. So echoing that none of us are free until all of us are free. Okay, y'all, I'm really excited to have shared this research project with you. This is a brief overview to be kind of digestible, get your feet wet in the topic. So, like I said, I'm always happy to share more resources, provide, citations, references, and of course talk more about the project as well. I hope this shows or demonstrates some of the ways that people can be involved in social movements and actively be working towards social change, even in situations that seem really difficult to do so. I think that's the broader takeaway for me is that no matter what you're passionate about, no matter what the stakes are, you can find people to organize with and you can work together and really have an impact. And I think that's so powerful. So I hope that's something that you take away from this presentation. And yeah, hopefully I'll see y'all online on Canvas, maybe around in other spaces, and have a good rest of your day.